In this session, we're going to be looking at the throne of David promises in the Old Testament. In my book, Leaving the Rapture Behind, I have a chapter entitled No Vacancy on David's Throne. You see, that's one of the claims of those who support the rapture system, the term I use in my book for the premillennial dispensational theology. And in that theology, when Jesus came to establish the kingdom, He did not do so. The kingdom prophesied by the Old Testament prophets was instead postponed to the distant future. In its place, the church was established as a parenthesis or a plan B, if you would. But the kingdom itself was postponed. Now, it's that postponed kingdom that would have as its ruler David their shepherd, David their king, David as the one ruler over the united nation of Israel. And so by postponing the kingdom promises to a future time, in essence, they are postponing the reign of David. Now, dispensationalists like Tim LaHaye and others generally understand that Jesus fulfills the basic thrust of the throne of David prophecies. However, they do not accept that Jesus currently reigns on the throne of David. They believe that that will take place someday in the future. Right now, Jesus is just reigning up in heaven, seated at the right hand of Almighty God. Now, I say just reigning because they view that as somehow not capable of fulfilling the language of Old Testament prophecy because they understand that that language must be fulfilled in a more literal fashion. Well, we'll come back to see how the New Testament writers understood that. As we glance through some of the Old Testament texts here listed for us, let's quickly look. In the book of Isaiah chapter 9, and there in verse 7, we read about the child. There in verse 6, a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on His shoulders. And His name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. We read, it says, that there will be no end to the increase of His government or of peace, and on the throne of David and over His kingdom, to establish it and uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. And so this future ruler, this child who will be born, this one who will bring about restoration for God's people, will be on the throne of David and over His kingdom. Isaiah gives us other references to David. For example, chapter 16 and verse 5, a throne will even be established in loving kindness, and a judge will sit on it in faithfulness in the tent of David. In chapter 11, more specifically, we read about the reign of this future king. He's called a shoot who comes from the stem of Jesse. And in verse 10, it will be in that day that the nations will resort to the root of Jesse. Stem of Jesse, root of Jesse. Jesse was the father of David. I think it may be significant that the Old Testament prophets did not say the stem of David or the root of David, but by saying stem of Jesse and root of Jesse, that makes us understand that the Messiah is going to be not simply a son of David, but He will be another David. He will be like David as a leader over a united Israel. And so the line of David again is being described here in the book of Isaiah. And as we come back to that passage, as we'll look at the conversion of the Gentiles, we'll see that Jesus, as the new David or the son of David, will do David-like things in His rule, as Isaiah 11 and other passages show us. We looked briefly already at the book of Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 23 and verse 5, we read about a righteous branch of David. And this righteous branch of David will reign as king and act wisely. Jeremiah 23 verse 6 says, "In his days Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell securely." The parallel there is in Jeremiah 33 and verse 15. We also saw in chapter 30 and verse 9, in connection with the time of David's distress, that the yoke of Babylon will be broken off of them. They would be restored to the land. And then it says David, their king, would be their ruler. He would raise up David, their king, and they would serve the Lord their God and David, their king. Well, these are just some of the prophecies, and we looked at Ezekiel 34 and Ezekiel 37 last time. David, their prince, David, their shepherd, David, their king. There's no question but that the Old Testament prophets prophesied that the future of Israel would be connected with the righteous, glorious rule of a future David. And we understand that David is a type of the Messiah, and that Jesus Christ fulfills the promises of a new David. Now that raises the question then on how the throne of David and the New Testament are to be tied together. And following some of the outline there in the chapter in my book, first of all, we need to briefly discuss the nature of Christ's present reign. Is Jesus now who reigns at the right hand of God? Acts 2:33, Romans 8:34, Ephesians 1:20, Colossians 3:1, 1 Peter 3:22. Christ seated at the right hand of God, is this in fulfillment of the promises to David and the promises of a future David? Well, I believe the evidence is overwhelming that is the case. Let me quote from you, though, John Walvoord, former president of Dallas Theological Seminary, a very popular dispensational author, has written a number of books on the subject. Here's his claim. This is out of his book, Israel in Prophecy. And on page 96, he says, of the 59 references to David in the New Testament, now that ought to be a clue for you right there, but of the 59 references to David in the New Testament, there is not one connecting the Davidic throne with the present session of Christ. Such an inference could be established only by spiritualizing many prophecies both in the Old and New Testaments. Well, in your study already for this course, you have come to understand something about the issues of interpreting prophecy and noting that there is a literal aspect of prophecy and there can be a symbolic or a figurative aspect in prophecy. Much of prophecy is poetic in form. The type points to a greater antitype, and so the language of the antitype will sometimes be in the language of the fulfillment will sometimes be in the language of the type. And so the fact that David is referred to 59 times certainly makes it suspicious here that somehow the New Testament writers are connecting Christ's ministry and his current reign with the promises to David. And to me, that's a pretty radical statement to say that there is really no evidence of connecting the terms. Now, Walvoord does admit one problem, but I would suggest there are many, many more problems than just the one. In what ways does Christ connect his ministry with David? Well, in Matthew 22, remember the question he asked the Pharisees, what do you think of the Christ? Whose son is he? And they said, well, he's the son of David. And then Jesus quotes Psalm 110. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. If David calls him Lord, how can he be his son? And no one could say a word in reply. And from that day on, no one dared to ask him any more questions. You see, the Pharisees didn't understand that the Messiah was not going to be an earthly political ruler, not a mere earthly king. they were looking for someone maybe like David with the limitations of an earthly ruler. But they didn't understand that the antitype would be greater than the language of the prophecy and greater than the type. You see, the Messiah could not only be the son of David, but he could be the Lord of David. And that's the point that Jesus is trying to make there to the Pharisees. Then if we'll just take a look for a moment at the connection between David's throne and the resurrection of Christ. To me, it's very clear that Jesus understood his resurrection from the dead as being in fulfillment to the promises of David. And with that, we could stop right there. If any aspect of what Christ has accomplished is in fulfillment to the promises of David, then that eliminates the notion that somehow these kingdom promises and these David promises have been postponed. So where do we go for this? Well, first, in the book of Acts, and we're going to look at two passages there. In Acts chapter 2, verses 29 through 36, probably familiar ground for most of us. But he has quoted there in verses 25 through 28 from Psalm 16. And in the context of that quote, there is a reference in verses, in particular in verse 27, because you will not abandon my soul to Hades, nor allow your Holy One to undergo decay. Now the application of that, here in Acts chapter 2, by Peter, he says, Brethren, I may confidently say to you regarding the patriarch David, that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. And so this language of not being abandoned to Hades and not undergoing decay, really in a literal sense did not relate to David. And so Peter goes on in verse 30, and so because he was a prophet, David was a prophet, and knew that God had sworn to him with an oath, 2 Samuel 7, to seat one of his descendants on his throne, he looked ahead and spoke of the resurrection of Christ. You see, David knew that one of his descendants would sit on the throne, and in doing so, he looked ahead and spoke of the resurrection, that he was neither abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh suffer decay. This Jesus God raised up again, to which we are all witnesses. And now look at verse 33. Therefore, having been exalted to the right hand of God. You see, David knew that one of his seed would sit on the throne forever. And now Christ is resurrected, as David prophesied, and has been ascended and is exalted at the right hand of God, and having received from the Father the promise of the Holy Spirit, he has poured forth this which you both see and hear. Now, it takes a lot of maneuvering and twisting here to get around the conclusion that Peter is claiming that the promises to David, that one of his seed would sit on his throne, it's hard to get around the conclusion that Peter is saying that that has now happened in the exaltation of Christ to the right hand of God. Well, we go on. For it was not David who ascended into heaven, but he himself says, The Lord said to my Lord, Sit at my right hand, until I make thine enemies a footstool for thy feet. Therefore let all the house of Israel know, note the language there, house of Israel, as we think about promises to Israel. Let all the house of Israel know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified. And so there's a strong connection there in Acts chapter 2 with the establishment of the church of a connection to the promises made to David. Let's go on over to chapter 13. Here in the first missionary journey, Paul is speaking at Antioch of Pisidia. And in Antioch, chapter 13, again, we see connections with the promises to David. Let's start at verse 30 of Acts 13. But God raised him from the dead. And for many days he appeared to those who came up with him from Galilee to Jerusalem, the very ones who are now his witnesses to the people. And we preach to you the good news of the promise made to the fathers, that God has fulfilled this promise to our children, in that he raised up Jesus. Clearly a reference back to the resurrection from the dead in verse 30. As it is written in the second psalm, Thou art my son, today I have begotten thee. We've discussed this already in connection with our study of Psalm 2. Now, as for the fact that he raised him up from the dead, no more to return to decay, he has spoken in this way, I will give you the holy and sure blessings of David. Now that's Isaiah 55, verse 3. We skipped over that in our listing of some of the verses in Isaiah. He's referred to in Isaiah 55, 4 as a commander and leader. But in Isaiah 55, we have this promise that the holy and sure blessings of David will be carried out. Remember what Isaiah 53 talked about. This was the suffering servant text and the death of Christ and his atonement for sin. Back to Acts 13:35. Therefore, he also says in another psalm, Thou wilt not allow thy Holy One to undergo decay. Going back to the same text there in Psalm 16 that we read there in Acts chapter 2. For David, after he had served the purpose of God in his own generation, fell asleep and was laid among his fathers and underwent decay. A further explanation here. But he whom God raised did not undergo decay. And therefore let it be known to you, brethren, that through him forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. So Christ is raised from the dead. That fulfills the language of the second psalm, Thou art my son, today I have begotten thee. And I said earlier that this was a royal begetting. Jesus at his resurrection is begotten of the Father in this sense of being a royal begetting. It's connected with the promises to David that his seed would not undergo decay. It's connected with the holy and sure blessings of David as it relates to the consequences of Christ's atoning work there, Isaiah chapter 55. So again, just from the book of Acts alone, we see a strong indication that the resurrection of Christ is in fulfillment of the promises that were made to David. Christ's present authority stems now from his resurrection, Ephesians chapter 1, verses 20 through 22. The question that must be answered is Christ's present reign then in fulfillment to the promises made to David? It sure seems that the New Testament is presenting it in that way. Let's talk for a moment about the throne of David as it relates to Christ's royal priesthood. Now we'll leave the book of Acts for a moment and go back to the book of Hebrews. Now Hebrews connects the kingship and priesthood of the Messiah. In Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3, at the end of verse 3, it says that when he had made purification of sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. So having become our great high priest, he now sits at the throne next to the Father. Or later on there in Hebrews chapter 10 and in verse 12. But he, having offered one sacrifice for sins for all time, sat down at the right hand of God. Again, Christ is now seated on the throne because he has made the atoning sacrifice for sin. Also, we see that in chapter 12 and verse 2. Let's back up a couple chapters, though, to chapter 8. We studied chapter 7 at length, dealing with Melchizedek and connecting that with Psalm 110. In chapter 8, verse 1, then we read, Now the main point in what has been said is this: we have such a high priest who has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister in the sanctuary and in the true tabernacle which the Lord pitched, not man. So he functions now as our great high priest. Again, he is seated at the right hand of the Majesty in the heavens. And so this royal priesthood, which now is being performed by Christ, is to be connected with Christ's reign. The Melchizedekian priesthood involved a king-priest kind of leader. And so this, I think, supports the notion that Christ is currently in fulfillment of promises to David. He is now on the throne, prophesied to Israel that their ruler would sit on the throne of David, and now functions as our great high priest. And so I think the Hebrews language there at least confirms the notion that Christ currently fulfills promises made in the Old Testament. You see, again, if promises made to Israel in the Old Testament have been postponed for the future kingdom, then how do we explain how the book of Hebrews applies these to the current time? If the church was a so-called mystery and not indicated in God's prophecies, if the church was added later, then how do we explain how the book of Hebrews cites all these Old Testament prophecies and applies them to Christ's current reigning at the right hand of God and functioning today as the Melchizedekian priest-king over the church? We're talking about Christ's present reign. He now functions in fulfillment of these Old Testament passages. That brings us then to Acts chapter 15. And we'll just conclude this session real briefly with a look at the relationship between David's throne and Acts chapter 15. Now, Acts 15 is in connection with the council in Jerusalem. And the dispensational scholars recognize the importance of this passage. They recognize the difficulty of the passage. I quote here in my book on page 62 from the Schofield Reference Bible, page 1169. Schofield said over a century ago, dispensationally, this is the most important passage in the New Testament. Schofield recognized the significance of Acts 15. Now, what's going on here? After the testimony of Paul and Barnabas and Peter, it says that James gets up and addresses the council. He quotes from the book of Amos, chapter 9, verses 11 and 12. And says in verse 14 of Acts 15 that Simeon, or Simon, Peter, has related how God first concerned himself about taking from among the Gentiles a people for his name. That's the issue at the Council of Jerusalem, is how to deal with the conversion of the Gentiles. And Peter has basically proclaimed that God is accepting the Gentiles on an equal footing with the Jews. He cleansed their hearts by faith, making no distinction between them. That was the testimony of Peter. And so James says, with this the words of the prophets agree, just as it is written. Now he doesn't cite Amos specifically, he says the prophets. Remember that by the first century, probably the minor prophets were all put together in a single scroll. It was called the Book of the 12. But the words of the prophets agree. Maybe there are some aspects of this, like the phrase, after these things, and the phrase, I will return, that are borrowed from other prophetic passages. The literal Hebrew, Amos chapter 9 says, in that day I will rebuild the tabernacle of David which has fallen. Well, James says that what is going on right now agrees with what the prophets said, or what the prophets said agrees with what has been testified to. And here's the quote, after these things I will rebuild and return and rebuild the tabernacle of David, the tabernacle or tent. Remember we talked about David's house, discussing 2 Samuel 7, the dynasty of David. And David's dynasty took a hit. That house fell apart, and what was left basically was a tent. And so this dilapidated dwelling of David is going to be rebuilt. I will rebuild the tabernacle of David which has fallen. I will rebuild its ruins and restore it, in order that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord, and all the Gentiles who are called by my name, says the Lord, who makes these things known from of old. There are some technical distinctions between how the Hebrew text read and how the Greek Septuagint read. The quotation Acts 15 primarily follows the Septuagint, although there are some slight differences in paraphrasing even that. But James says that what Amos prophesied agrees with what is now happening in the New Testament church. David's tent has been rebuilt. The Son of David has come. The Davidic throne is now occupied. And in connection with that, the Gentiles are going to be brought to the Lord. Again, we'll look more at the conversion of the Gentiles as a topic. But by quoting this passage in Amos, James puts the dispensationalists on the hot seat. Because James seems to say here in Acts 15 that the promise of the rebuilding of David's dynasty and promises made to David are connected with the conversion of the Gentiles, and all of that is connected with the first century experiences that are being related here by Paul and Barnabas and Peter here at the Council of Jerusalem. Well, John Walvoord, again, in his book, The Millennial Kingdom, pages 203, 204, makes this admission. He says, about the only reference that can be construed as having any connection with the identification of David's kingdom reign and the present session of Christ is that found in Acts 15, verses 14 through 17. Well, earlier he said there was really no clear connection. Now he says this one could be construed as a connection. And in reality, this is a significant text because it is a clear connection between the promises made of this future Israel led by David, in which the Gentiles would be brought to Israel, a clear connection between that and the experiences in the first century, and therefore an example of how Old Testament prophecies about the kingdom and about the throne of David are fulfilled in the New Testament church. There's a lengthy article in the journal Bibliotheca Sacra, number 111, and that comes from October 1954. A lengthy article by Willard Aldrich entitled The Interpretation of Acts 15, verses 13 through 18. And he really goes at great lengths to try to explain away the language here found in Acts 15. He believes, for example, that after these things means after the church age. Kind of a strange way to use the prophecy to try to point out that what's happening there at the Council of Jerusalem is being spoken to by Amos, when the way that Aldridge suggests it's being used is that Amos is being cited to refer to things that will happen after all of this. Aldridge argues that the phrase, I will return, is a reference to the second coming, not the first coming. And yet throughout the Old Testament, the phrase return, God is going to return, is often used in reference to His coming back to restore His people following their captivity. Jeremiah 12:15. After I have uprooted them, I will return, and I will have compassion upon them. And that may be a possible reference that is being cited here. And then the phrase agree. They said, James doesn't say that the prophets are being fulfilled, but rather that the prophets agree. Well, again, I think they're really struggling here to try to make the disconnect. I believe this is one of the most important passages in the New Testament, a citation of Old Testament prophets, because it does make that clear connection that I believe is made elsewhere as well. Let me close with this one thought. It seems to me that in the rapture system, there has developed a concept which I will call the analogy principle. And it goes like this. Anytime an Old Testament prophecy seems to be quoted in the New Testament as being fulfilled by the New Testament church, the dispensational theologians seem to invoke the analogy principle. What that means is that they are saying, well, this prophecy really isn't fulfilled in the church, but what's going on in the church today is analogous to what will someday happen during the millennial kingdom. So they recognize, they admit to all these connections, and they keep saying, well, yeah, today is an awful lot like what will someday happen, which is what the prophets have predicted. And so the principle of analogy has been invoked here. Old Testament prophecy, although it seems to be fulfilled by the applications in the New Testament, really are not being fulfilled in the church age, but what is going on in the church age is similar to or analogous to what will someday happen in the millennial kingdom. Well, if that makes any sense to you, then give me another chance next time to work on you a little bit more.